Now we're getting really practical. How do you start a conversation, transition a conversation? I'm going to give you 5 different ways to do that. You don't have to do them all, but depending on who you are and your background and what your comfort, it will help you to do that. But before we do that, let me say this. We all tend to overthink everything. And so one of the ways that, and I do that as well, one of the ways it calms my heart is before, listen, this is a very important statement, before I talk to people about God, I need to talk to God about people. And so I've got a section in the book about prayer and about the importance of praying for the harvest. And they're in the textbook, so I'm just going to mention these briefly. We need to pray for boldness. That's a biblical prayer. In Acts 4, they're being persecuted. They didn't pray God make it easy. They didn't pray God strike down our enemies. They prayed God give us boldness. And the place was shaken where they were assembled, and they spoke the word with boldness. We pray for the Spirit's power. This is spiritual work. This is not a sales pitch. We're not trying to convince somebody to we're not trying to close a deal. We're trying to share people the truth and give them a gift of salvation through the gospel. And so Paul in Ephesians 6, when he talks about the armor of God, at the end of that says, praying always in the Spirit. It's a spiritual work, and so we partner with the Spirit so we're never alone. We need to pray for harvesters. Matthew 9, Jesus said, pray the Lord of the harvest to send out, to drive out harvesters. Did you know when you share the gospel with someone, you're the answer to Jesus' prayer in Matthew chapter 9. You're one of those harvesters that's being driven out. We need to pray for specific people. I want to encourage you to do something practically because your witness should grow out of your overall spiritual growth. Do any of you keep a journal, a spiritual journal, okay? A lot of great saints in history have. Maybe you don't do that. I'm an author. I'm a writer, so it's normal for me to keep a journal. So I like to keep a little journal and write things down, and it helps me because I am diagnosed ADD, okay? How many ADD people does it take to change a light bulb? You want to buy my bicycle? I actually have a gas golf cart for sale. You want to buy that? Squirrel! Okay, so you already got that by now, right? And so I need focus. I need help with focus. And so keeping a list of people for whom I'm praying really helps me. I pray specific things for my family, for my children-in-law. I pray specific things for my church, for my school. And so keeping a list, I think, is really, really helpful. So I want to encourage you to pray, and I want to encourage you to begin to pray. How do you know if God is really growing you in your witness if you're not talking to Him about that? But what if you started, maybe not every day, but 2 or 3 times a week, just writing a little paragraph about, Lord, this is where I am in my witness. These are the people I'm praying for. And then after 6 months, you look back and read over that. You would be able to see your progress. In the same way, if you're gonna lose weight, one of the things they tell you is start writing down what you eat. And it's kind of surprising how much we eat, okay? And so you keep a journal. You want to be fit? You just go into the gym and throw around some weights? No. If I have a set workout that I follow, I have a time. I tell my students, I love you, but if you see me in the gym and I got earbuds in, I'll nod to you, but I'm not stopping to have a conversation because every 45 seconds, I'm doing the next set. And so I got a journal, and I got it written down, and I got a timer, and I am on it, man. I'm in there 45 minutes, and I am sweaty, and I am done. But you know what? If I didn't do that, if I just kind of meandered into the gym, I wouldn't get nearly as in shape. I would take more breaks. I wouldn't push as hard. But by keep it, and same way, it's the same thing in your spiritual life. We tend to compartmentalize our spiritual life over here and everything else over there. But it's all similar. The same way you need to keep a record and keep up with what you're eating if you want to lose weight, or keep a focus on what you're doing exercise-wise to get more in shape. You need to keep some kind of a journal, a track, so that you can look back over that every so often and see that God has, in fact, done great things. I've gone back and read over prayer requests that God's answered, that in the moment I was so desperate for an answer, and I don't even remember that now, except I had to go back and read it in my journal. So it's good for me to remember those things. So here's your principle. Effective evangelistic conversations connect the unchanging gospel. We don't change the gospel with the specific issues people face. What we want to do is show people where the gospel applies to their life. I meet very few people today. There's still some I meet. There are definitely people like this. But I don't meet a lot of people who say to me, basically, can you prove it? Prove to me that Christianity is true. I meet a lot of people who say, can you live it? How does this help me live my life? How does this connect to my everyday life? And we want to show them some ways to do that. And so I'm going to give you 5 approaches that You don't have to do them all, but sometimes we forget that one of the best things you can do to learn to grow spiritually is actually just to practice. It's not an unspiritual thing to practice, so maybe try one of these approaches with a friend and see. So the first one we've kind of gone over. The first one is stories. Stories. We've talked about the story of the gospel and helping people think about the gospel as a story with the cross and resurrection in the center of that story. And here's a simple process you can do. Ask a person, tell me your story. I do that with young adults all the time. Hey, I want to get with you and hear your story. People like to tell their story. I mean, it's all over social media, our profiles and everything. We're always updating. We're always telling our stories. Ask people their story. Let them tell their story. And don't judge their story. Well, you shouldn't be doing that. Don't do that. Just listen. Let them tell their story. And then you can share your story. Okay? So, sir, where are you from? Fuquay-Varina, right? So you're local, okay? Here's a guy from Fuquay-Varina. I could ask him about, what's your name? Fred. I could ask Fred about his story. He could tell me about his life growing up in Fuquay-Varina. I'm sure the place has changed a lot since you were a little boy. And whatever, doesn't matter what he says. I am interested, by the way. I'm not just looking for a way to share the gospel. I actually like to get to know people. That's important. It's not bait and switch, okay? So I'm going to hear his story and things about it. Did you farm or anything like that? Okay, so I will find some things about his life that I can connect with, like, okay, that's similar to my family, or I can say some things different. Well, that's not like my family, so it's similitude or contrast. Okay, oh, you did this in your family, well, my family did the same thing. Or you did this in your family, my family did something different. In the same way, you're having a conversation. And then I'll say, well, I grew up in Alabama. And I grew up just outside Birmingham, kind of like Fuquay-Varina is just outside Raleigh. Okay, so that's similar. And I grew up in a home with my family were in church, and I could talk about that a little bit and talk about how I met the Lord when I was 11, because that's just part of my story. If you really know Jesus, how in the world can you tell somebody your story and not talk about Jesus, right? And so the key is, you say, well, my testimony is not exciting because I was 12 when I came to Christ, and I wasn't an axe murderer or anything like that. No. The focus is not your experience. The focus is the Christ of your experience. So focus on Christ. And so you can just share. You listen to their story, you share your story, where you came from, how you came to realize you needed Christ, how Christ changed your life, how Christ has made a difference in your life to this day and guided your life. And then you can share the gospel story. And you can do that in sharing your own story, by the way. You can share the gospel through sharing your testimony. And in a day like today where people love to share stories, that's a great way. For me, that's a very practical way. That's just easy for me. It may not be for you. Okay? So that's the first one. Here's the second one. This is simply asking good questions. Okay? And there are different questions you can ask. I've got several of them in the book. But for example, don't ever ask anybody, do you go to church? Don't ask a yes-no question. Ask, when do you attend church? Where do you attend? See, that's a more positive thing. You're assuming the best. You're kind of assuming they are in church. So even if they're not like, oh, great, this Christian's about to nail me, you know. No, and when I ask the question that way, I've discovered if somebody's not in church, they'll just say it. Well, I'm not really in church right now. Okay? Well, I'm a part of Richland Creek Community Church, and at my church, we believe that Jesus is, and I just share the gospel right there, okay? And so tell me, ask some good questions. In your opinion, what is a real Christian? In the book, I talk about a student of mine named Joshua. I saw him in the weight room one day, and he was thanking me for some things I wrote in my evangelism handbook. It's always good when you write a book and somebody actually finds it helpful. It's almost a shock, okay? And he sent me an email. And he talked about certain questions. Sometimes it's just for you just to learn when you're starting out sharing your faith, just learn a couple of questions that are natural to you. And for him, it was, when you attend church, where do you attend? And what do you think a Christian is? What do you think a real Christian is? Or what do you think about Jesus? And in the email, he talked about how he led two people to Christ, one a total stranger and one a co-worker that he had a pretty good relationship with. So it didn't matter whether it was a stranger he met at a coffee shop or a guy that he knew pretty well. In both cases, what helped him get into the gospel conversation was simply having certain questions. So it might just be that you want to experiment with learning some questions to ask people to help you with, because we struggle with the transition to the gospel, right? And sometimes questions help. Here's the third approach, affirmation and encouragement. Now this is really important, and I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm about to say. We never endorse a lifestyle that is dishonoring to Christ. Whether it's somebody in an obviously unbiblical relationship, people living together, or it's just a Baptist who's just mean as a snake. Okay? You know, whatever. We never want to endorse that. But you can, listen, you can affirm a person as created in the image of God without endorsing their lifestyle. And in the book, I talk about a teenage girl who was a bisexual who came to Christ. And I didn't slam homosexuality. I didn't slam other views of gender and so on. I didn't do that at all. I lifted up Christ, but I got to know her. I built a relationship with her. And out of that, my affirmation of her as a person, she had different colored hair, and my daughter does hair. So I talked to her about her hair, and we talked about arts, and we found some things in common. And because I affirmed her as a person, and I didn't just slam her, I never endorsed her lifestyle, but because of that, she came to Christ. I was preaching at a church some months ago, and I was talking about this joy of God that I talked about earlier and how the gospel gives us joy. And I was talking about this is why I personally don't believe gay marriage is a biblical concept. It is not right. Not because I'm anti-gay or I'm a homophobe or something like that, but because God, when He created the world and He made us in His image, He created marriage as a beautiful picture of a man and a wife, two very different people coming together and showing forgiveness and showing, it's a beautiful covenant that demonstrates the gospel. And so I didn't slam the LGBT community. I simply affirmed biblical marriage and talked about how when we follow God's plan, it brings us joy. After the service was over, benediction, a young man came up to me and he said, "Can I talk to you?" And I said, "Of course." And he said, "I haven't been in church in many, many years until today. I came with a friend." And he said, I'm a homosexual, and I'm a drug addict, and I'm miserable. When you talked about joy, he said, I realized that's what's missing in my life. Long story short, he came to Christ. Not because I slammed homosexuality and told how awful he was for being a homosexual, or I capitulated to homosexuality and made it like it wasn't a big deal. But I focused on the joy of God in the gospel and how God created us in His image. And it was that affirmation of His personhood without affirming and encouraging His lifestyle that caused him to hear. Does that make sense? Because we stink at this, guys. We stink at this. We really stink at affirming people in the image of God that are different from us. We live in a cultural context, and it's so divided because all of us tend to focus on people we don't agree with, and we define them by their worst day. It happens in politics, it happens in sports, it happens in religion, it happens in everything. And we don't like it when somebody says, because you're an evangelical Christian, and they take some one really negative example of an evangelical that is a knucklehead, and they say, that's the way all evangelical. We don't appreciate that, but yet we do that with others because we don't know people. We never endorse sin. We never endorse wickedness. But when I'm with my neighbors, and I don't drink alcohol personally, and I certainly don't affirm drunkenness, the Scripture does it, but I don't ever go to my neighbors and say, well, you shouldn't be drinking that stuff. They're grown people. It's legal for them to do that. But I don't endorse it either. So my neighbors invited my wife and I over for a going-away party for some other neighbors, and they gave us water bottles, and they did a toast, and we had water bottles, okay? Because I'm not trying to convince somebody about a certain view of alcohol, I want people to know Jesus. Does that make sense? And so I think it's really important because in the workplace, we can just be kind of awkward and we can just kind of be rude while we think we're standing for our convictions. You can stand for your convictions and still be sweet to people. And I think that's just really, really important. A fourth approach is the heart. Now, some people are thinkers. And I like to use the word bigger than mayonnaise every now and then, so I'm going to use a few right here, okay? So we call this orthodoxy. That's right belief. These are people who believe in sound doctrine. These are guys at seminary that love to read theology all the time. They don't want to ever go anywhere and do anything, but they just like to read theology all the time, okay? And these are people that like to argue and that kind of thing. But it's not always, I don't just make it negative. It's also people who love truth and love to affirm truth and learn to study truth. And there are people, some of you in this room are wired that way, okay? You just love to learn, okay? Some of us are doers. I'm kind of wired that way. Most Baptists are. I'm a Baptist. We're activists. We're missions. We're going to do stuff, okay? And some people are really feelers. We really have affection toward people, and we really care for others. And so you don't have to be an expert at this. But if you start thinking about people you know, whether they're saved or not, you know people that when you start thinking about it like this, you think, okay, that guy, he's a doer. He's always doing stuff with his hands. He's always about some cause. Well, then what I want to do if I want to talk to him about Christ is I want to show how Christianity really does work. It really does make a difference in our everyday lives, and it does give us something we can do with our life that's bigger than us. If I talk to somebody who really cares and really is effective, if you will, really a loving kind of person, I want to talk about the love of God, and I want to share with them about the love of Christ. David Brainerd, the missionary to the Indians, talked with surprise that when he was talking to Native Americans in the American colonies about the gospel, before he actually started talking to them about sin, he just talked to them about who Jesus was and who Jesus is. And he just proclaimed to them the beauty and the love of Christ. And he said it was an amazing thing, happened more than once. The Native Americans he preached to began to be melted over their sin. They began to be broken over their sin. But it wasn't his calling out their sinfulness and the judgment of God. It was talking to them about the love of God, because the Native Americans he was speaking with were very emotionally driven. They were very effective in their context. And so to hear about the God, the Creator that they were searching for and how much He loved them, that actually caused them to be convicted for their sin. But it doesn't hit everybody just like that. But some people it does. So that's just one of the ways we think about people, because here's the reality. We live in a culture that is very driven by emotion. And so just to try and argue somebody intellectually, for some people that's very important. But for some people you want to touch them at the point of their heart. And I've seen this especially be true with young adults. We live in a culture driven by songs and music and art and poetry and so on. And then there's a fifth approach that I want to mention, and that's to go deeper. That's to get underneath the level, okay? And I talked about this in an earlier session, so I won't say much about it now. But when I talk about passion or pain, in other words, if you're really going to talk to somebody about their relationship with God, that's a pretty big deal, right? That's a pretty heavy subject. You got to get beneath the, what do you want to do? No, I don't know. What do you want to do? What do you want? How are you? I'm fine. You know how we do that? We don't even pay attention. You got to get deeper than that. But here's the thing I want you to understand. You can really go deep with somebody in a first conversation. I think about a lady named Allie. Last year I wrote a Bible study for a curriculum called the Gospel Project on sharing our faith. And I talked about Allie and Colton, who were in our Young Pros ministry. And the first time I sat down with Allie, I just walked through creation, fall, rescue, restoration. It completely made sense to her. She had never really heard the gospel. Grew up in America, grew up in New England. They were living together like most young adults do today. They were engaged but cohabiting. And I shared this good news with her. And man, the first time she heard it, she wept and she trusted Christ. It took Colton a little longer. But sometime after that, I baptized them in the Atlantic Ocean with my iPhone. That was a mistake. I didn't mean to do that. And then I married them on the shore. They're in Wilmington, North Carolina, and now they're expecting their second child, and their whole life has been transformed. But I was able in one conversation to get very deep with Allie about some hurt in her life and about some pain and about some hopes and some dreams in her life. And so I mentioned servers. Here's something I started doing years ago, because I eat out a lot. I travel a lot. I speak. I eat a lot of restaurants. I asked the server if I can pray for them. I've asked thousands. I've never had a server upset with me. Any servers here? Anybody here ever work as a server? You know, they don't like us on Sundays. They don't like to work on Sundays because Christians have a reputation of being kind of rude and in a hurry and so on. Now, if you're going to pray for the server before the meal, ask them to pray for them, but leave a good tip. Okay, if you're not going to leave a 20% tip, don't pray before the meal. Act like a pagan, okay? Better for them to assume you're not a believer than you to open your wallet and remove all doubt. And heaven help us, don't leave one of those little booklets that looks like a $20 bill unless you're going to leave a $20 bill, okay? That's the vandalism, okay? Don't do that. But I started asking servers if I could pray for them. I mean, all over the world. And the response is anything from, the least response I've ever gotten is, I'm good, which is very rare. Twice in the last month I've gotten, wow, I've never been asked that before. I need to think about that. People like it when you pray for them. Okay, I think I mentioned in the book about a young lady, my wife and I were at Texas Roadhouse, and I said, can we pray for you? And she said, yeah, you did that a couple of months ago, and I didn't even remember it because I'm ADD. She said, you prayed that I'd get a car. I'm a single mom, I need a car. And 2 days later, I got a new car. I mean, not a new car, but I got a car. So all my students at seminary want me to pray for them to get a car. And I'm like, no. But we need to pray believing and expect God to answer, okay? And really care for people. We don't go into restaurants to be served. We go in to serve, okay? Like Jesus came to serve. And I've seen, I remember early on when I first began to do this, I was in Baltimore, Maryland, going to speak at a pastor's conference. I had some students with me because I take students with me all the time on trips. And it was late night at a Mexican restaurant, and our server's name was Jessica. And I said, Jessica, we're going to pray for our meal. How can we pray for you? And she stopped and she said, you want to pray for me? That's awesome. And she left. And then she came back and said, I have to think about it. I'm a college student. Pray for my college. And we went along, and it was quiet. You know, if it's really busy, you don't want to embarrass them, and you know they got their job to do. But it was quiet, and I said, this is what she said. She said, "You're the nicest people that I've ever served." That's just because we asked if we could pray for her. And I pulled out a little gospel booklet I had at the time, and I was going to leave it with her because I knew she was working. And I just want to give her a few main points, and I was kind of going through it very quickly. She said, wait, slow down. I said, well, I know you're working. She said, it's okay. Look, there's nobody here. She pulled up a chair and sat down. And then the bus boy, Timmy, was looking over his shoulder. I thought at first to get on to her, and he said, no, I'm just listening. And both of them came to Christ that night. And I didn't know them from a bar of soap before we walked in that restaurant. So you can get close to somebody quickly, not by demanding that you get to share, but just by showing compassion and caring for them and seeking to have a conversation beyond, I'd like this order and please refill my tea. You can have real conversations. My wife and I go to Cracker Barrel regularly in Henderson, North Carolina. It's on the way to a little farm we bought. And twice lately, somebody else has paid for our meal. And I don't know if it's served, I don't know who it is, but we kind of have developed a reputation there. The servers love us. We're generous. And let me say this, I've not always been like that. Man, I early on in ministry, I'd tip well if they were good. I wouldn't if, and man, God really broke me over that, how arrogant I was to treat people like that. And so one of the ways we can start conversations with people is just say, hey, can I pray for you? And it's amazing the responses that you'll get. So here's what I want to ask you to do. I want you to think about these 5 approaches. Think about it, did one of those just kind of, oh yeah, that kind of sounds like me. Or I'm kind of already doing something like that. And then just experiment and then just kind of test it.